So today we're doing the Turbo Duo. This represented the complete Turbografx experience, with its CD add-on included as standard, released in the US in 1992 for a very reasonable price of $299. At that stage you could also buy the individual components for around $230 odd as well, a very different price bracket to its main competitor, the Sega CD. The Turbografx, otherwise known as the PC Engine, was a 4th gen console that never really saw much success in the West, but in Japan it was actually quite popular. Now anyone familiar with the channel will know that we have a set of rules for the lists, one of which is that import-only games that require knowledge of Japanese are automatically disqualified. Now this creates a problem here, as whilst the Turbo has a reputation in the West for being primarily a shmup console, what actually grew its popularity in Japan was primarily JRPGs, most of which were not translated. Which puts me in a bit of a quandary, because that means a lot of the best games aren't actually eligible for the list. I decided in the end to just include a quick list at the end of the video of what the Japanese public consider are the best JRPGs on the system. So anyone so inclined can check them out and play them through with a guide or some such. Anyway, that's enough for the intro, let's get on to the games. Starting out the list we have Cheeky Cheeky Boys, a nice Capcom platformer that has you jumping and slashing your way through ruins and forests one minute and flying through the sky or swimming under the ocean the next. You get a sword, a wall bounce and some limited screen clearing magic abilities to use along the way. The game has pleasant graphics, good CD music, and whilst not including all of the minor adventuring additions that were added to the Mega Drive version, unlike that version, it does at least actually retain the fun 2-player cooperative play that version omitted, which is a respectable trade-off. This one is a puzzle game where the aim is to peck away at the ground in an attempt to cause the enemies to sink into the water. Splashtake seems deceivingly simple at first, but as you progress, the levels become cleverer and require more active puzzle solving. On top of the puzzle solving, the core gameplay of jumping over the enemies and pecking the ground is just simple fun in its own right really, and results in a playable and accessible experience. This is a pretty solid top-down football/soccer game from Human's Formation Soccer series, which was the same series that the SNES's Super Soccer hails from. These play a little like games like Tekken World Cup or Microprose Soccer and the like. The game has some improvements to polish and presentation, running a bit more fluidly than previous editions. I'd say it's definitely the best representation of the sport on the PC Engine. Here the Turbo actually got an exclusive sequel to Icom's classic point-and-click adventure game, Shadowgate. The game changes things up quite a bit. It still has a point-and-click interface with you using the cursor to investigate things and manipulate objects, but we have an actively controlled character to move through the environments too now. And prepare yourself to see this poor little guy suffer a lot as the game is full to the brim with gruesome deaths lurking around every corner. Seriously, this is old school adventuring, so save your game often, as sudden deaths will regularly just pounce on you from out of nowhere. The puzzles here are fun to work out, and it's got a lot of atmosphere. So this one is a platform game with some mild similarities to Bionic Commando. Forset Amour, if that's how it's pronounced, gives you a melee strike, magic to use, and a grappling hook to swing yourself up to higher platforms. Level design here is pretty respectable overall, and the grappling hook is a cool weapon to master, as you get some limited invincibility when swinging upwards that allows you to bounce on enemies a la Sonic the Hedgehog. It's admittedly a little slow at times, but the high level of presentation, with nice cutscenes, good graphics, and fun grappling gameplay make it worth trying. So this one is a cartoony top-down racer that's somewhat reminiscent of games like Micro Machines and Super Off-Road. The focus is on hectic multiplayer shenanigans, with everybody vying for the top position, and in using their winnings to buy weapons and equipment. The game also gives you a jump button to avoid hazards and your opponent's weapons, and everything here is quite polished and looks pretty reasonable too. Bear in mind though that the party experience is where it's at where this game is concerned, with this mode being a ton of fun. There is a single player experience of course, but word of warning, those AI controlled cars cheat like hell and may have you throwing your controller at the wall in fury. So this is an interesting one. Silent Debuggers is a sort of proto first-person shooter where you have to clear all of the enemies out of a space station that you've become trapped on. This has to be done level by level. As the game progresses you get new abilities turning up, such as the ability to teleport around the station, and you need to make sure to protect your base from alien incursions too, as you'll permanently lose access to sections of it if not defended properly, and many of these sectors provide you with much needed help, with some controlling the station's lighting for example, and others allowing for health and weapons refills. There's a sort of narrative running through the game, with simple cutscenes playing as you progress that I find to be a really nice touch, and the game can still be quite tense at times, even now. Bonanza Brothers is actually a quite unique game from Sega. The game has you playing as thieves who are set to rob a series of buildings. Gameplay is actually quite focused around stealth, with you creeping around the environments waiting for the guards to turn their back on you, and using the environment to your advantage. It's an interesting and fun game, but is a little on the short side. The game also has an excellent 2-player co-op mode that runs in split screen, where the two of you are free to run around the building at will, carefully coordinating your heist together, which actually makes the game quite replayable, to be honest. The only console conversion of the time of the popular Capcom arcade game that went on to spawn Forgotten Worlds. Turbografx Sidearms recreates the look and feel of the arcade game with consummate ease. It's a shooter where you can fire both forwards and backwards, each with a dedicated button, and switch between a bunch of different weapons on the fly. I'll always remember the arcade game as being this kind of famed game of my youth that my brother would always talk about in a glowing light, but which I never came into contact with, so it was interesting finally playing it on the Turbo so many years later. It's a fun game overall, though difficulty-wise it's easy to tell its origins, as this is a real quarter muncher, and unfortunately this port is missing the 2-player co-op. That's really the only major absence in an otherwise faultless port. Tatsujin is a solid, tough vertical scrolling shmup from genre favourites Toplan, who were one of the most important shmup companies of the time. Graphically it all looks very nice with some striking colour usage, and the power-ups are pretty impressive too. The high difficulty definitely makes it a little frustrating at times, but the game also manages to be quite compulsive, and you'll feel like you always need to have just one more go. As a port, this is very good, definitely a little better than the Mega Drive version I'd say. Unfortunately it's usually very overpriced, but if you do find a good deal for it then snap it up. The East games were quite important for the Turbografx, with its collection of the first two games representing one of the most important early releases for the new CD format. This third game, on the other hand, is kind of the red-headed stepchild of the series, representing a major departure. Unlike the earlier games, which were top-down view action RPGs, this one is a side-on view RPG with a lot of platforming focus. The results are a little mixed, to be honest. It feels a bit unpolished at times, and must have some of the worst implemented parallax scrolling I think I've ever seen. But it's still a pretty fun endeavour, and the music is phenomenal, as is usual for the series. This version, which was actually the original version, stands up pretty well to the Mega Drive port of the game, with superior colour and music, but weaker animation and parallax, and is easily much better than the SNES port, which felt kind of rushed and was worse in most aspects, truth be told. So Volfeed, otherwise known as Ultimate Kicks, is the third game in Taito's Kick series, a series of puzzle games where the aim was to claim a certain percentage of the stage by cutting it out piece by piece, while avoiding the enemies. The second game in the series was a somewhat disappointing outing. This third game in the series, however, is a huge improvement and really fleshes out the main gameplay mechanics, improving on the power-up system by adding a lot more things to collect, including some new, more dynamic power-ups like the ability to shoot, and having their collection being based around circling the blocks and the stages, instead of them just floating around, which works a hell of a lot better and really complements the game's core mechanics. I'd say this is probably the best game in the whole series actually, and its PC Engine port is very nicely done as well. Here's a strategy game set in Japan made by Cinemaware that was a fairly popular game on computers like the Amiga. In the game you instruct your troops around a map, taking territory and dispatching enemies and forming alliances and such. It's in the Defender of the Crown or North and South school of strategy games, where the strategy elements are broken up by little mini-games to decide the outcome of battles and such, with you personally running through the fortress grounds attempting to find the cobblestone paths leading to the keep and kill the general when trying to take the fortresses, or playing a bow and arrow minigame when defending them. The game was actually mentioned by the creators of the acclaimed Shogun Total War series as being one of the game's main influences. The Turbo version here was ported by a Japanese company and has been expanded upon with revamped graphics and music, and some changes to the way the battles work too. All in all, a nice version of an early strategy classic. The Turbo only got one Madden game released for it, so it's fortunate that this one is a pretty solid effort all in all. The Mega Drive Classic has been transferred over pretty well, and due to the CD format we also have some fun, cheesy little cutscenes playing throughout the game. It's just the classic Madden gameplay we all know really. It's just a shame that none of the later iterations made it to the system. So this is one of the oldest games to make the list, a racer from way back in 1987, which was actually the release year of the PC Engine in Japan. It was a fairly impressive game for the time, with pretty smooth scaling and nice colourful graphics, but to be honest definitely has aged a bit. Bear in mind that this was the same year as the NES's Rad Racer and a Master System port of Outrun, so a comparison with 16-bit games like Top Gear or the Lotus games is understandably not going to be that flattering. Still, the Outrun-inspired gameplay and colourful graphics make it a fun and breezy game to play in short bursts, and the game does add some car maintenance aspects to the mix too. So this was a nice little Zelda clone arriving in 1989 for the console. Utopia doesn't stray too far from its main influence. You explore, you gain upgrades, you push blocks and you blow up walls, etc, etc. But there are some quality of life improvements, in addition to the expected graphical upgrades of course. The most important addition is a compass that points to the next dungeon each time, making for a little more modern feeling and accessible game than the classic 1980s NES action-adventure releases of the time, which tended to just throw you into their worlds with no indication on where to go at all. The NPC dialogue and world building in general is also a slight improvement, but other than that this is just Zelda 1 really. You'd think with this solid first try, the sequel would expand and improve on the title, but sadly whilst having a handful of improvements of its own, the second game on the system is so similar it often just comes across as an expansion really, or perhaps even an enhanced remake. Given that the second game arrived 2 years later and went up against A Link to the Past, it really didn't do enough to keep up with the competition over time, and came across as being quite dated by the time of its release, unlike this one which at least had some advancements for 1989 and not such fierce competition. Sun Sun 2 is a pretty nice game from Capcom featuring large explorable levels, shops and loads of climbing and platforming elements. Funnily enough it has almost nothing in common with the original Sun Sun, instead being more similar to another Capcom arcade game called Black Tiger. The game has you playing as a monkey whose main attack is an extendable stick, but whom can also buy and use magic. There's also some other interesting items, such as a gauntlet which allows you to punch through some walls to find secrets. Anyone familiar with Dragon Ball or the old TV show Monkey will immediately recognise the themes here, as all are influenced by the same hugely popular Chinese novel, Journey to the West. The game's quite challenging at first, but once you've got a lay of the land and know what to buy, it all starts to fall into place. Here's what is actually a really good, lesser known vertical shooter from Data East. The game is a frenetic and exciting shooter with fast gameplay and a screen that's always packed to the brim with bullets and enemies. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that sometimes it even manages to approach the sort of mayhem you'd expect from a Saturn or PS1 shooter. The power-ups are impressive, the boss battle's well done, and all in all it's just a fantastic representative of the genre. If you find yourself craving something a bit more intense in your Turbografx shmup, then this might be the one for you. Here's a good platform outing from Hudson which has you kicking and punching your way through the stages as Jackie Chan, taking on all sorts of weird and wonderful opponents. Great pacing, versatile melee combat and impressive boss fights abound. The game doesn't stray from the usual platformer template much, but one thing that does change the gameplay up a little here are the bonus stages that are hidden throughout the levels. Successfully finding and playing these bonus games refills your health and gains you continues, and given that the game strictly limits continues, it's really imperative that you get good at this aspect of the game. Overall it's a fun platformer with some catchy music and fluid gameplay. This was a popular fighting game in Japan that came in the wake of Street Fighter 2 that actually tried something a little different. While it contains a lot of the special moves that made that classic famous, there's also a set of RPG-esque elements here, with you able to build up and customise your character, attributing points to different stats and such. The fighting is done pretty well here, with a lot of moves on offer and options, and in fact it can actually be played as a management game where the computer controls both players too, if wanted. And unlike many of the other classic fighting games on the system, it doesn't require the largest memory expansion card either. As an aside, for anyone who doesn't know, the Turbo CD had memory expansions released for it, much in the same way that Nintendo released the expansion pack for the N64. The first expansion was included as standard with the release of the Duo, but the last one, the arcade card, was not. So Flash Hiders actually works on a vanilla Duo, whereas a lot of the other fighting games require this arcade card expansion. Exile is an action-focused JRPG which switches between a top-down view for the overworld and villages, and a side-on view with platformer gameplay for the dungeons. The game has quite good presentation for its time with impressive cutscenes and voice dialogue, and US company working designs provide a colourful and elaborate translation here as usual, even doing a somewhat professional job with the English voice acting, which was almost unheard of at the time. It's also noticeably superior to the Mega Drive version, with better presentation and higher quality translations. It's a fun game, but it's a little on the short side. This one is a block-falling puzzle game similar to Puyo Puyo that was based on Hudson Soft's popular Bomberman brand. Like many of these games, Panic Bomber has you matching colours 3 in a row, attempting to set off a chain reaction to dump garbage on your opponent. Though here the game also has a mechanic where it throws bombs at you. The black bombs just pile up, but the red bombs detonate them and set off a chain reaction that can clear away all of the bombs on the screen. Overall, it's another nice representative for fans of the genre that also manages to have some of its own interesting nuances. So this was a great port of the two-player Capcom arcade game. It's a simple but addictive game with a setup somewhat similar to stuff like Space Invaders, or even more apt would be Hudson Soft's old computer game, Bubble Buster, which this was clearly inspired by. The way that the bubbles bounce and split into smaller bubbles when shot makes for a much more frantic and engrossing experience, with you needing to aim and dodge at the same time whilst trying to make sure you don't end up causing the screen to become inundated all at once. It's a fun game that's accessible and easy to pick up and play, with a nice two-player cooperative feature too, and this version includes some really nice CD quality music in it as well. Valis was a cult series of platform games that had a lot of links to the Turbografx. The system actually got ports of all of the games in the series, well, all of the proper ones anyway. Sadly and infamously, the series would end with a cheap sexploitation game. Not only did we get Valis 2 through 4 here, but the first game got a pretty respectable remake of the original 1986 clunker too. For this entry we're going to cover the fourth game in the series, which was the follow-on from the true standout release, Valis 3. Unfortunately, this one represented a step back for the series, with noticeably weaker level designs. But the third game's character swapping mechanic actually arguably may work a little better here, with a better selection of more varied characters. Graphics are also good, with more parallax scrolling than was seen in the earlier games, and some good cutscenes. Chuman Fu is a puzzle game where the goal is simply to push the coloured spheres around the screen onto their colour-coded bases. You can also shove these spheres forwards with force to deal with enemies, as well as bash through fences. The puzzle solving really comes in the form of navigating the cramped mazes, making sure not to get yourself stuck defenceless in a corner or block your route. The premise works well and the game is fun. There's a lot of levels here, some editing options, and some welcome two-player modes too. The developers went a very different direction for this sequel to the popular Legendary Axe, going with a more Geiger-inspired horror theme for the art design and a slightly more conventional system for its weapons and power-ups, losing what was one of the main unique gameplay mechanics of the original, the power bar. The game has you hacking and slashing your way through an army of malevolent monsters and navigating some nicely designed platforming layouts. All in all, the game is successful. Much of the new artwork is definitely striking and memorable, especially for the bosses, but personally I do feel it doesn't quite live up to its predecessor. Loom is a memorable point-and-click adventure game from LucasArts, who were pretty much the gold standard where it came to the genre. It was a fantasy-themed game ported from the PC in 1992, a couple of years after its original release. Gameplay has you exploring the rich and detailed world of Loom, solving puzzles and learning new musical spells. It's a memorable example of its genre that tried to experiment a little in comparison to many of the other point-and-clicks of the time. It has a great story, a lot of humour, and thankfully fairly intuitive puzzles too. Avenger is a vertically scrolling shooter where your helicopter can rotate left and right and have its aim locked in position by holding button 1. The game doesn't stray too far from the pack, but it's a fun shooter with engrossing gameplay, good controls and some nice level designs, feeling kind of like a prototype of the Dreamcast game Zero Gunner 2 in some ways, but mixed with Toaplan shmups like Twin Cobra or Twin Hawk. This is essentially a reworked port of the groundbreaking computer classic Dungeon Master, but split into different stages and given a more detailed storyline. Dungeon Master was a genre-defining Western RPG released for the Atari ST that popularised many important elements. It had you exploring large dungeons in first-person view, picking up equipment, gaining experience, manipulating objects and doing a lot of puzzle solving. It's a smart old-school dungeon crawler that has an impressive amount of freedom and lateral thinking for its time, and it was ported pretty well to the PC Engine here, with the manual even including a map of the first level to get you started. Image Fight 2 is a vertical shooter that plays very much like its HuCard predecessor, but with better graphics. These games have you picking up a selection of pods which float beside your ship, and the key to mastering them is to get good at manipulating these orange pods, which can be used to fire in any direction. Like the first game, and Irem's shmups in general truth be told, Image Fight 2 is a very challenging title that has very tricky, intricate gameplay to master, which makes it quite rewarding to learn. So this one is actually a remake from Arc System Works of the classic puzzle game Solomon's Key, now with an added movie license behind it, as well as updated, revamped graphics, new music and a bunch of new levels too. In fact, there's so much new stuff here that I wasn't totally sure whether to call it a remake or a sequel. And all of these extra stages here don't make the game more of an uphill struggle either, as this version even includes a password save. The simple premise here is to collect a wand, which opens a door in each stage, and then to reach that door. The interesting thing here is that you can create and destroy blocks out of thin air, for instance to make steps or to pull the ground out from under an enemy, which is a clever gameplay mechanic that went on to influence a bunch of other games. Overall, the changes here are great, the new music is really well done, and most of the graphics and art design is an improvement too, though there are a few exceptions here and there. This is a cool puzzle game. It's kind of like the classic NES series, The Adventures of Lolo, except with Bomberman's bomb mechanics. In the game you have a certain amount of bombs to destroy all of the little flags, boats, treasure chests. I'm not entirely sure what they are, to be honest, but you have to destroy them all and collect their gems. The secondary objective to each stage is just to cause as much damage as possible. This will gain you more money, which has to be used to pay for extra lives, which you'll need later on. The bombs you're given have a variety of effects. Some let you move faster, while others have a bigger blast radius, for example, and you have to work out when and where to use each bomb to solve the puzzle. The mashup between the two games actually works really well, and there's a lot of fiendish layouts here to rack your brains over. Just a nice and unique puzzler with nice art design and a lot of imagination. Some may recognise this series by the title World Class Baseball, which is what the original game was renamed when released in the US originally. Well, Hudson continued their baseball series for many updates in their native country, none of which were released elsewhere, and this 1993 edition is definitely one of the better baseball games that I've played on the system, with more variation in the player appearance and improvements to the computer AI. Definitely a respectable baseball game for a system generally not known for its sports titles. Neo Geo fighting games are very well represented on the PC Engine CD, with many of them brought admirably to the machine by the brilliant Hudson Soft. World Heroes 2 is no exception, and in fact is possibly the most accurate to the arcade original out of all of the already accurate ports that they released. It's very impressive. On the outside this looks like just another Street Fighter clone, but it actually does have a bunch of gameplay differences. The main one being that the normal attacks use only 2 buttons, with the strength of the attack being decided by how long the button was pressed, a control setup that translates to the Turbo's original default 2-button controller quite well. Other than that, you can also reflect your opponent's projectile attacks by blocking at the right time. The roster here is also quite cool, with you playing as legendary figures from history, such as Genghis Khan, Joan of Arc, or Hulk Hogan. Overall, it's a cool, forgotten fighter with great presentation and character designs that is absolutely orders of magnitude better than the SNES port, and frankly not that far off of the expensive Neo Geo release either. This one is a top-down racing game, somewhat akin to a futuristic version of Micro Machines, mixed with art design more like F-Zero perhaps. Motor Roader 2 is a massive improvement over the lackluster original, and in fact has little in common with it in general, truth be told. The control here is great, the graphics are nice, the courses are well designed and memorable, with jumps, floor boosts and hazards littering the tracks, and you can also upgrade your vehicle with a plethora of parts, and kit it out with all sorts of different weapons to take out your enemies too. Most important is the excellent 5-player races though, with the weapons providing a lot of mayhem and fun. So here we have Last Alert, otherwise known as Red Alert in Japan. The game is your general top-down arcade shooter. You run around leaving death and destruction everywhere you go in an effort to get revenge for your fallen comrades. It doesn't stray too far from the genre formula, but there are some more mission-based levels here and there, and in general it represents the genre staples well, with good movement and a variety of weapons to use. The game also has some very memorably cheesy cutscenes and hilariously bad voice acting in the English version of the game, which to be honest serves to make it quite a memorable and likeable title. One of the more original games on the engine, this has you controlling a photographer as he walks through the levels. It's your job to help him avoid hazards and take pictures of weird things as they happen, with the photos giving you a certain amount of money. Each level has a required monetary objective to pass, so you have to make the most of every picture. It's a good premise which provides a lot of memorable fun, and it contains some legitimately laugh-out-loud humour too. Eldis is a shooter which has you flying through the weird and wonderful stages dispatching some wacky enemies and bosses. It's made by the same company as Paranoia, which was a pretty respectable HuCard shmup. The power-up system has you simply picking up pieces of equipment, with the item cycling through a selection of choices until grabbed. There is admittedly a little bit of a language barrier at first, as the items actually have Japanese writing on them telling you what they are, but thankfully after a while you do begin to recognise the symbols. A good shmup with cute themes, respectable and varied power-ups which give you a lot of choice, and some nice level design. The third game in the Bubble Bobble series heralded a return to what the series knew best. Two-player shenanigans within a simple gameplay structure of you both dispatching the enemies in new and interesting ways. Here you again play as the chubby boys from Rainbow Islands, free from their dragon curse. You pick up an assortment of different enemies and throw them at each other to clear each screen. There's a parasol here which can be used to float as well as collect other elemental weapons that can be released on the enemies. And some memorable boss fights too. Definitely a must for anyone wanting something to play with a friend on their PC Engine. This one is a fantasy-themed vertically scrolling shmup from Compile, who were pretty much the company for shmup enthusiasts at the time, known for their Alesta series of games. Compile actually blessed the Turbografx with quite a number of shooters, by far the most of any of the 4th gen consoles, a factor that plays a part in why the system's held in such high regard in the genre. This one, Sylphia, is mildly reminiscent of popular shooters like Felius and Legendary Wings. It's what you expect from a good shmup, good power-ups, a lot of action, and some nice boss designs too. Just a fun and playable no-nonsense offering in the genre. So this one is a really offbeat shooter from Messiah, the company who made the excellent Mega Drive shmup Wings of War. Now anyone familiar with that game will remember a highly questionable boss on one of the levels with a suspiciously phallic looking appendage. Well, with their Choa Nikki series, which I think translate to Big Brother or something like that, Messiah decided to throw away all pretensions and dial this element up to 11. Making one of the most notoriously camp games ever made, with you piloting some half-naked muscle-bound dudes through space, shooting at a bunch of other half-naked muscle-bound dudes. I'm not going to say the game is super gay, but, well, it is kind of super gay really. The main thing here is the novelty value, truth be told. The visuals are just so weird and memorable that you're curious on what crazy thing is going to turn up next. There's a weird system in it where you have to do fighting game style button combinations to pull off attacks, which is kind of clunky, but it does work okay after you get used to it. This isn't a game for everyone, that's for sure, but I'd imagine that anyone watching the montage playing currently will know if this is something for them or something they need to avoid at all costs. This was a clever horizontally scrolling shmup where you can cycle between a selection of different firing directions as required for each situation. The game is quite tricky at first, but is rewarding to learn, and it was actually quite well respected by the gaming press back in the day. Unlike the Mega Drive port, this retains the 2-player co-op mode, which is great fun. The game defaults to easy mode and gives you on-the-spot respawns, making it a little less challenging than the other versions too, which may not be a bad thing depending on the player. This is a fun strategy game that mixes turn-based hexagonal movement with action-based battles. In Bastille, you move your units around the map trying to take buildings. Each building you take gives you money every turn, which can be used to buy a huge variety of different mechs and vehicles. Whenever you land on an occupied area, a battle ensues where you control the unit and have to shoot at and evade the enemy manually. The game actually makes a decent attempt at including a storyline, including a bunch of little cutscenes throughout that cover the war between the two opposing brothers, and is also a 2-player option for more challenge. The game also had a sequel that was not released outside of Japan that fans might want to check out. Cosmic Fantasy II is a reasonable JRPG for the time that has all the usual tropes you'd expect. You go on an epic quest exploring a big world, buy equipment in towns, meet new people and take on dungeons. The game is pacey with little grinding and has a pretty good plot that has some twists and turns and likeable characters. And the translator's working designs produce some funny dialogue here too. It's the CD format that lends it what has to be its most impressive qualities for the time though, its animated cutscenes and high quality music. There were actually quite a lot of games in this series released for the PC Engine, but sadly this was the only one that reached the West at the time, with the far better 4th games in the series never reaching these shores. Thankfully they can finally now be experienced on the Switch though, through a recent re-release compilation. Aeroblasters, otherwise known as Airbuster, is an excellent 2-player horizontal shooter that has you flying over ravaged cities, piloting through zero-gravity space, and taking part in high-speed chases through tunnels. Power-ups are caught as they fall down the screen after release, and you also get a fairly weak screen-clearing attack which has to charge, which is an interesting mechanic which you need to strategically use, mostly being useful for clearing away bullets. Overall, Aeroblasters is yet another arcade port with smooth gameplay for the engine, with colourful graphics, good music, interesting power-ups, and possibly most importantly a 2-player co-op feature that is a lot of fun. In comparison to the more readily available Mega Drive game, this is very comparable. Perhaps it's slightly weaker graphically at times due to some pure black backgrounds, but it's generally more colourful and I'd say for the most part I prefer the music here too. So this is actually probably the best home port of Rainbow Islands available, arguably even better than the arcade original itself. Rainbow Islands is a unique and original release from Taito that has you climbing up the tall stages, creating rainbows to either use as stairs or as a weapon against the myriad of monsters populating the levels. Coloured gems are hidden in the stages and are revealed by dropping the rainbows onto the enemies so that they land in a specific position on the stage, with each horizontal point on the floor correlating to a different coloured gem. All these gems are required to properly complete the game and get the full ending. This is all usually a very difficult task, but the main thing about this version is that the PC Engine game actually allows you to save and replay the levels in order to get hold of the missed gems, which is a very nice addition. So Raiden was a bit of a benchmark game for vertical scrolling shooters when it arrived in the arcades. It was a shooter with great pacing, nicely designed weapons and lots of action. It's actually sometimes held up as a progenitor of the bullet hell subgenre due to its frantic action and elaborate bullet patterns. Most of the 16-bit versions of the game came out disappointing for one reason or another. All of the versions of the game are a little bit inaccurate, but here the PC Engine version is a pretty good compromise. The on-the-spot respawns have been replaced with checkpoints, but it still somewhat works. It is sadly however missing the 2-player option. They did make a CD version of the game much later as well, but this was kinda disappointing. They improved the music and they also added some more levels, but personally I'd rather they'd just made the game a little bit more accurate. Perhaps just providing an arcade mode with on-the-spot respawns. And it also came out way later than this as well. Made famous by the fun version of the game on the NES, this Japan-only U-card was a lot closer to the arcade original than that NES Classic, which had actually been largely redesigned to better fit the hardware. Of course the PC Engine had no problems recreating the arcade original and has the full teams with little to no flicker. Here you get a very over-the-top version of Dodgeball where the focus really isn't on realism. On top of the normal rolls and moves, characters also get super moves which do more damage, and players will often hit the opposition so hard they'll go careening off the court. Overall it's just a whole lot of fun that doesn't take itself too seriously. So this game is part of the Soldier series, which was Hudson's popular Shmup series of the time, that started way back on the NES and received numerous iterations over the years, with even an N64 sequel many years later. The series started out having similarities to Tekken's Star Force, but with this one, the first iteration to reach the Turbo, the game took on some elements from Compile's Blazing Lasers too. Here you get to choose from 4 different impressive colour-coded weapons, and also a secondary auxiliary weapon. The graphics and audio are great, and everything runs very impressively smooth. As mentioned, this was the first to be made for the Turbo, and it represented a huge leap forward for the series, and also really established a lot of the hallmarks of it going forward. As such, while better Soldier games did appear, this was still one of the most important releases the series saw. One of the more original and underappreciated games on the system, Gomala Speed is a fun, arcade-style puzzle game where you control a snake as it slithers through the stages growing by collecting additional segments, with the ultimate goal of eating food, done by encircling it, all whilst avoiding hazards and dropping timed bombs, a la Bomberman. The graphics are minimalist but clean, and strangely reminiscent of Gauntlet at times, and the music and sound effects are well done too, but it's a clever, well-designed gameplay and interesting core concept that really make it a title worth checking out. Kadash is a platform/action RPG mashup from Taito that was ported from the arcades in 1991. The crux of the gameplay involves the usual platforming elements, but you also get the experience points, character classes and shops and equipment that you'd expect from an RPG. The game is a tricky but fun 2-player outing with a simple but likeable storyline. It's not that long but does have replayability in the form of the aforementioned classes, with each character playing very differently to each other. The art design here is nice and the game is really colourful, overshadowing the drab visuals seen in the later Mega Drive port. And unlike said port, this also has all the arcade classes available, whereas that Mega Drive release was actually missing the Priestess and Ninja. Definitely the best way to play what was a pretty nice arcade game. This was a cool little Taito platform game which has their classic Bubble Bobble feel to it, except in this instance transferred to a more traditional platform game setup, with horizontal scrolling and moving platforms. The game has you throwing water, which bounces along the ground and runs down slopes, at the enemies to incapacitate them, at which point they can be shoved off screen, comboing and taking anything in their way with them. The game has a ton of charm, the levels are well designed, even providing multiple routes to choose from to add some variation, and it has some really memorable, wacky boss designs with great pixel art too. A very likeable game. So this one is an accessible pick up and play fighting game with an all-girl cast. Asuka 120% has some nice character designs with a good selection of moves and is fairly unique for its time, as its fighting system actually differs quite a bit in comparison to games like Street Fighter 2, and possibly ended up inspiring games like the Guilty Gear series. The combos here are very easy to do. You get dashes and double jumps and can pull off aerial combos too. This edition, subtitled Maxima, is the third game in the series and the first to make it to consoles, with all the previous ones appearing on computers. It offers a good few improvements over its forebears in content and gameplay, and the game would be further expanded on with later releases appearing on the PlayStation and Saturn. A good underrated fighter, and unlike many of the other fighters on the Turbo, it doesn't require the arcade card either. This was a really impressive tennis game for the time, gaining a lot of critical praise. Final Match Tennis is from the developer Human, who made the Fire Pro Wrestling series, and they did a very good job here across the board. The game looks nice, controls well with a nice number of moves available, and has a decent number of options too, including 4-player support. A strong offering in the genre. Here's a nice platform game for the system that you rarely hear about. Momotaro Katsugeki is a fun, humorous game that does all of the platforming fundamentals well, has nice level layouts, and throws in some simple adventuring elements for good measure too, with some villages and shops with weapon and armour upgrades and such, as well as some useful items that replenish your health. As your adventure progresses, you also run into some buddies who help you along the way if you feed them the multicoloured balled sweets that you can buy in the shops. The game is actually an offshoot title of a very popular series of JRPGs made by Hudson Soft that were based on Japanese folklore about a boy named Momotaro who was born from a peach, and as far as I can tell the game generally seems to follow the story too. Sadly, all of the more famous games in the series, being JRPGs that were never released in the West, are pretty much incomprehensible for non-Japanese speakers, and are therefore ineligible for this list. A shame, as they were some of the more important early releases for the system, but with this one primarily being an action game, it's a different matter entirely here. I'd be lying if I said this was totally import friendly, but generally everything in the game is pretty straightforward. The shops and items are clearly marked, and the equipment is automatically equipped. You push up at the statues to save. The main issue here is navigating the menu really. It's a borderline case for sure, but you can certainly learn the game through trial and error alone, and I'd say it's somewhat worth the trouble. So this one might be a controversial placing, as the PC Engine's version of Strider actually gets quite a bit of flack, and I have no idea why really. Well, maybe I won't go as far as saying no idea. I can kinda understand why people might be a bit disappointed with this, as not only is it not quite up to the famous Mega Drive port's quality, but it also actually required the largest and most expensive RAM upgrade available for the system, the arcade card, which really should have been more than adequate to do an almost arcade perfect port of the game. Make no mistake though, what we have here is still a pretty authentic playing version of Capcom's classic, that's clearly leagues ahead of most other platformers on the system. An exciting action game that introduced some memorable gameplay mechanics of its own, primarily its dynamic climbing mechanics that had you grappling around the imaginative levels. It just doesn't look as nice as it should. On the upside though is some nice CD renditions of the game's soundtrack, and even better, a bunch of extras not seen in any of the other ports of the game, namely some new cutscenes, voice acted dialogue, and even the exclusive new level set in a desert, which itself was a pretty reasonable offering. So yeah, a bit disappointing, but still a lot of fun. Bear in mind that the game is still as hard as nails though, but this also helps to make it one of the most rewarding games to master of its time. So here's a smart, attractive looking shooter that actually contains a lot more ideas and personality than the average scrolling shmup fare. Magical Chase showers you with a multitude of different control and power up features. You get hovering stars which can be set in place anywhere you want that are used to deflect enemy shots. Your shot direction itself can similarly be fixed or moved, giving you full multi-directional firing that's independent of movement. And on top of all that, there's a bunch of weapon and health upgrades that can be acquired from shops too. Outside of those elements though, the levels never fail to be interesting, and the cute art design is really nice and imaginative. I'll add though that it's worth playing the game on hard mode to get the most out of it, as for a game as pricey as it is, Magical Chase can be beaten without too much trouble on the lower difficulties. Still, it's an absolute joy to play through and is one of the better HuCard shmups on the system. So this is an interesting one. It's a branch off from the Dragon Slayer series, which was one of the most popular and influential JRPGs ever made in its home country of Japan, but which saw very limited exposure in the West, with only the third game, which was known as Legacy of the Wizard, and another offshoot, Faxanadu, getting proper release here. That was until this one arrived on the Turbo, with proper translation and English voice acting. The game would go on to spawn its own highly popular and long-lasting series, the Legend of Heroes series, which unfortunately would not see another release in the West until like a decade later, when remakes were released for the PSP, but which would eventually gain some traction when the PS3 games would gain worldwide releases. The game is quite an early release for the system, so it's not going to wow anyone with its graphics, but it is a well-crafted game for its time, with some charm, funny dialogue, a certain degree of strategy, and a decent length, so it still manages to be a worthy purchase for JRPG fans, especially those who are fans of the series. This is a very admirable two-player port of Capcom's classic World War II vertically scrolling shooter. The series this hails from, which was one of the earliest of its genre I might add, differs quite a bit from your general vertically scrolling shmup. On top of the ever-present screen-destroying bombs, you also get a limited number of barrel rolls that give you temporary invincibility. And actually, even said bombs function differently, as they can be used as many times as you want, but actually deplete your energy bar on use. The game was getting a bit long in the tooth by the time it came out on the PC Engine, but was still pretty fun. But that's only half the story, as at the end of the game we find that the PC Engine actually has a completely new, revamped set of modern feeling and far more varied levels included, that were easily enough to be released as a standalone sequel. This bonus content, so to speak, is almost solely responsible for the game's position in the list. It's a hectic, adrenaline-fueled experience of non-stop bullets and carnage that has far better levels, presentation and boss fights than the original arcade game, and stands out as one of the most impressive shmup experiences of the generation. You can actually also just play this mode on its own by playing a specific set of songs in the options menu, which is what I tend to do. For the sequel to their excellent shmup Spriggan, which had been one of the best vertically scrolling shooters on the system, the developers here really decided to change things up a bit, and the game ended up barely recognisable to its predecessor. The results can be a bit jarring and underwhelming at first. Unlike the original, this is a horizontally scrolling shmup that has you piloting a mech with multiple different weapons that can be cycled through on the fly. Each weapon has a limited amount of ammo allocated to you for each level, and as such has to be used only when necessary. And you also get a regenerating health bar. Graphics here are a bit on the weedy side, though the scrolling is pretty nice. But as the game goes on, more and more mechs become available for you to choose from that have different interesting loadouts and more types of ammo. Meanwhile, the action also gets more hectic, with the regenerating health bar element often now leading to tense firefights where you're desperately trying to avoid bullets just long enough to recover. Note that there's a lot of cutscenes in Japanese in the game, but these can be turned off in the options. In the end, it's actually a pretty welcome departure for the series and a pretty unique shmup. So this first Bomberman for the Turbo, which was actually confusingly the third game in the series to just be titled Bomberman and nothing else, is quite possibly the most important of them all. This, along with the Game Boy release from the same year, were the games that actually introduced the all-important multiplayer battle mode, a mode that would pretty much define the entire series, and would be almost solely responsible for its enduring popularity. While the Game Boy release did manage to beat this to the market by a few months, that version only supported 2 players, while the one here is more recognisable to what that mode would become in the future, and it actually supported 5-player battles. The later Bomberman 2 for the NES only even managed 3-player the subsequent year, and had a bunch of other downgrades to boot. Of course, admittedly, a lot of what's done here was improved upon with time, and 2 more classic Bomberman games with many improvements were released after this one on the system. But being such a critical release for the console and series, I thought it worth mentioning this one here too. So this one is a great exclusive fighting game based on the Far East of Eden series of games. This was an absolutely huge PC Engine RPG series in Japan that remains beloved in the country to this day over there, with the second game still topping lists of greatest games ever made. Sadly, as you'd expect, like many of the best RPGs on the PC Engine, they were not translated at the time, making them ineligible for the list. I have heard Working Designs were interested in doing the translation at the time, but unfortunately this didn't pan out. Anyway, back to this game. As said, it's a fighter, and gameplay-wise this is very much a Street Fighter 2 derivative. But it's done very well, it often looks fantastic. Bear in mind that this is a game that requires the arcade card expansion. Has speedy movements and responsive controls, and being that it's based on an already established and beloved property, we have a fully formed cast of interesting character designs from the outset. Outside of the usual gameplay mechanics and excellent graphics, the gameplay also incorporates desperation moves that can only be used when your health bar is low, which gives it a slightly different feel. A very welcome addition to the system's fighting game library, all in all. This top-down shooter has you going deep into enemy territory in an attempt to single-handedly rescue the President. Bloody Wolf was another one of the important early HuCard games released in the West that established the console as being impressive for arcade action titles. There's no deep gameplay here, just shoot them before they shoot you, but there is items to collect and vehicles to ride, and it's all very fun. As an arcade port, this is actually very impressive. If it wasn't for its lack of 2-player support, you could easily call this an improvement in fact. The graphics have actually been added to, and there's even some new levels here too. Might Magic 3 is an ambitious first-person RPG that tries to create a completely seamless pseudo-3D world. Unlike many of the other RPGs seen on consoles from the era, this keeps all the overworlds, villages and dungeons in first-person perspective. You just walk around from place to place, exploring the world and everything in it, taking in the sights. Like most of the best Western RPGs, this is quite non-linear. You're free to look around, gain experience and search for your own feats to accomplish, so there's a lot of freedom of choice. The game gives you an entire party of characters to control, and has a lot of depth, with characters having a large number of different stats and talents. Some characters are better at lockpicking, for instance. On top of gaining experience and buying equipment, you can also find new abilities for your party. All in all, it's an in-depth game that is just filled with interesting features and nice touches. Konami's excellent parody of their Gradius series of shooters was transferred brilliantly to NEC's Small Box of Wonders. Here you pilot your craft through some of the most imaginatively wacky and memorable levels in shmup history. The Gradius power-up system is as fun as it ever was, the bosses are a joy to behold, and slowdown is fairly minimal for the most part too. Unfortunately, this version is missing a few sections. There's no battleship stage, for example, and it also doesn't have quite as many extras as the absolutely phenomenal Super Nintendo port did. To be fair, the SNES version was easily among the best and most polished shoot-em-ups to be released for the system in general. All in all, this is still a pretty nice version. The SNES port had some very minor censorship for the Dancing Girl boss, which isn't the case here. And this version actually also includes its own exclusive points-based attack mode that I'd say is quite a bit better than the SNES's comparable offering. This mode actually has 3 completely exclusive boss fights for the series that trigger depending on how many points you achieve, which is a cool inclusion. Sequel to the well-loved HuCard game. Like its predecessor, Dungeon Explorer 2 is an action RPG that kind of plays like a 5-player Gauntlet, but with a simplistic experience system thrown in. This sequel aimed for a little more cohesion in its world, with the overworld villages and dungeons joining together in a more seamless way than in the original. The game is also a little more non-linear, rewarding those who explore with extra chances for gaining experience, as well as secret characters to find. The plot is also more extravagant and includes video cutscenes. All of this serves to bring it closer to its JRPG contemporaries, without losing what made the original so great. So Daytona Twinbee is a vertically scrolling 2-player shoot-em-up from Konami, from their popular Twinbee series of games. Games which have an odd and admittedly somewhat inaccessible power-up system where you have to repeatedly shoot bells to change their colour before collecting them. Having just played the graphically attractive but narcolepsy-inducing SNES game previously, I approached this one with some level of trepidation, but happily my fears were quickly allayed as this is actually a great game. The graphics obviously aren't up to the standards of the aforementioned SNES title, but they're still pretty good, and happily the challenge which was so completely absent in that game is here in spades, with the memorable levels requiring you to properly practice and master them to make progress. Good layouts, good difficulty curve, great boss fights and a tricky but interesting power-up system make this what is, in my opinion, the best game in the whole series. It is just unfortunate that this version is sadly missing one of the stages, the desert area, but the game is still long enough to provide a decent challenge and it's quite replayable too. This has to be the best top-down shooter on the system as far as I'm concerned. An underrated release which has you driving a tank which can be powered up with multiple gun types, each of which can be upgraded independently by finding the pods hidden throughout the levels. These gun types can also be swapped between on the fly, with each having different strengths for different situations. The controls here admittedly take a little getting used to. One of the buttons locks your direction in place, allowing you to fire one way whilst moving another. But before long you find yourself double tapping your way through the stages, dispatching the multitude of enemies. The action here is great, it's fluid and frenetic, the levels have a lot of variation from one to the next, always throwing in new elements, the weapon upgrading works well, and I quite like the futuristic art design too. Definitely an undervalued release. This vertically scrolling shoot-em-up is a parody of the Star Soldier series, in the same way that Parodius is a parody of Gradius. The game looks great and has fantastic presentation and imaginative backgrounds. You can play as a variety of ships, one of which is actually a flying Bomberman White, and there's some good power-ups too. Just a likeable shmup all in all. Next, I think that's how it's pronounced, is a challenging vertically scrolling shooter with impressive power-ups and addictive gameplay. The presentation here is great, with some really nice spacecraft designs and some impressive animation on the enemies, with them spinning out and exploding or rotating as they pursue you around the screen. And the whole thing is just infused with classic 90s Japanese aesthetics and music too. In fact, the music here is fantastic in general, and the game has to contain one of my all-time favourite soundtracks from the era. Everything here is just decidedly smooth and well crafted from start to finish. If you're a hardcore fan of the genre, then definitely check it out. The game that introduced the world to Bonk, or PC Genjin as he was originally known in Japan, the star who would go on to become the console's mascot. Bonk's Adventure is a platformer that has you controlling a caveman as he headbutts and flips his way through the game's imaginative and often funny stages and scenarios. Some elements which set the gameplay apart from other platformers are the abilities for Bonk to spin in mid-air, allowing him to glide, and his talent for headbutting enemies from both above and below. Altogether, these elements make for a fun, humorous game where experienced players are able to bounce from enemy to enemy, gliding or juggling them as they go. This underrated mech-themed scrolling beat-em-up, Mad Stalker, was a great release for the genre that has all of the usual elements you'd expect, with you making your way through its city streets, kicking arse and taking names, and each section needing to be cleared before you can move on, a la Final Fight. But it also provides you with a really good, quite large moveset of Street Fighter 2 style attacks too, including projectiles and Shoryuken style uppercuts to deal with those pesky flying enemies, as well as dash and block moves too. Sadly, the game is only one player, which I find is generally a death sentence for brawlers, but the enemies here are varied in tactics, and the graphics and music are top rate too. And like many brawlers, you also get a fighting game mode that actually can be played in 2-player, and this mode is actually far more fully featured here than what you generally see in similar extra modes. The makers of the excellent Guardian Heroes, Treasure, actually named this game as an influence, which is nothing to be sniffed at either. The Turbografx library got off to a blistering start in the US, launching with some of the most impressive and playable games of the year. Legendary Axe was one of those standout titles, a well-paced arcade-style action game with excellent graphics and locales, and a good few of its own gameplay ideas too. Here you have upgradable weapon power and weapon speed, which grow and accumulate until you lose a life. You also get a power bar for your weapon that auto-recharges after every swipe, and when it's at maximum you do greater damage. This system encourages careful timing and precision over mindless hacking and slashing, and it gives the game a unique rhythm of its own that works pretty well. Here's a very good port of the classic Sega arcade game, probably the first to actually come close to recreating the game at home, rivaling Sega's own belated Mega Drive version, which wouldn't see release until the subsequent year. While the game was getting on a bit even here, it had been one of the most important, truly standout racing games in the history of the genre, and as such still held up pretty well, with some colourful vistas to drive through, catchy music and fun gameplay that had you not racing against other racers but the clock, having to hit each checkpoint in a time limit, which always lent a lot of feeling of urgency to these games, creating a lot of tense last minute near misses. As said, it is a good version, colourful and with pretty smooth scaling on the roadside objects. All the routes are here, and for the most part the music is well translated too. A very nice version of Capcom's arcade game. Forgotten Worlds is a horizontally and occasionally vertically scrolling shoot 'em up where you can rotate your character to aim in 360 degrees. The graphics here are really nice, easily outdoing the more well-known Mega Drive port in both colour and background detail, and the audio is fantastic too. Sadly, this version is missing the excellent 2-player co-op, and while great, the graphics are missing out on parallax scrolling. But outside of that, it's a far more complete port of the game than the more famous Mega Drive version, which was actually missing 2 whole levels and some enemy types. Everything here, on the other hand, is faithfully recreated. A laudable job all in all. This one is actually an enhanced port of the Master System's superb Dragon's Trap, which was one of the greatest games on that system, and in fact one of the greatest games of the entire 8-bit generation. Dragon's Curse is essentially a Metroidvania which has you exploring a big non-linear world filled with enemies and hazardous jumps. Every time you defeat one of the bosses, they change you into a different creature, with each having different abilities that allow you to take routes in the world which were previously unpassable. And a lot of these different creatures have unique and original moves that keep the game fresh as you progress. Overall, it's a pretty good port, the most noticeable improvements here being the smoother scrolling and somewhat improved graphics here and there. To get out of a contract with Sega, some of the game's characters have been changed. The lion is now a tiger, for example, but the new designs are pretty good. It's probably not quite as improved as it should have been given how much more powerful the Turbo's hardware is over the Master System, truth be told, but it's still a great version of an all-time classic regardless. Lemmings is a puzzle classic that's seemingly available on pretty much everything. The aim of the game is to lead the little lemming guys from the entrance to the exit by giving them orders such as digging or building, trying not to lead too many of them to their deaths. It was a very interesting and innovative game when it came out, and many games took influence from it. Even Nintendo's own Mario and Donkey Kong on the Nintendo DS many years later owed something to this game. The PC Engine port is a pretty good version. It has a 2-player option and Red Book audio. And most importantly, it actually also has the mouse support from the original computer releases, unlike the Mega Drive and SNES versions where it was only the sequel that gained that support. Overall, it's a good version of a great game. So here we have the first game in Namco's popular Splatterhouse series. This series was pretty much the closest we Turbografx and Mega Drive owners could get to a proper horror game back in the day, with the first one being a console exclusive to Turbografx in the West, and the second and third coming to the Mega Drive. The games are beat-em-ups where you make your way through the creepy environments, bashing monsters and doing some simple platforming jumps here and there. You get different weapons to find and pick up, and there's alternate routes that take you to different sections of the levels which have varying difficulties. A nice touch which adds some minor exploration elements to the game. The thing which really makes the game stand out though are its memorable set pieces and monster designs. It's got a whole load of style, and the whole thing just oozes with spooky atmosphere during a time when that was pretty rare in games. Here we have the third game in the Valis series, which is probably almost unanimously considered to be the franchise's best offering. So this was a cult series of platformers that started out on computers with the very makeshift, very janky first game, whose main claim to fame was its animated cutscenes and storyline, which would likely go on to influence those of the famous NES game Ninja Gaiden a year later. The game would see some modest improvements to gameplay in the second release, but again the focus would be on the cutscenes. This third game though actually heralded a much needed improvement to the gameplay. Not only was the movement more polished and level design far more interesting, the developers also incorporated some elements from Konami's Castlevania 3, giving you multiple characters to swap between and some similar moves. These changes really fleshed out the gameplay and completed the overall experience. On top of those changes, the game also gives you a skid, which unintuitively is actually used to cross gaps. Some stages are really tough here, but there is a save capability. Valis 3 is actually quite advanced for its time. I'd initially guessed that it had arrived probably around 1992, but when checking I was shocked to see a release date of 1990, a few months before the launch of the Super Nintendo. The presentation would have been astonishing at the time. The game would end up being ported to the Mega Drive, but that version lost a whole bunch of levels, predictably lost the voice acting, and had the famed cutscenes of the game downgraded too, so this is probably the one you want to go for. So this was a very impressive port of Konami's arcade classic. This second game in the series added some memorable set pieces and bosses, with fiery landscapes and crystal asteroids, and gave you the option of choosing between 4 different ships with different weapon setups, which was a nice addition. All in all, it was a pretty nice iteration in the series. In fact, so nice that when it came to making Gradius 3, Konami basically just shamefully rehashed the entire game again, just swapping the fire dragons for sand ones. This PC Engine port of the game has great music as can be expected, but Konami went the extra mile and even got a lot of parallax scrolling into the game too, which was admirable. So here's a port of the Mega Drive's excellent Wonder Boy and Monster World game. A cute and colourful action-adventure title where you travelled around gaining new abilities and opening up new areas of the map, whilst fighting a plethora of monsters with spear and sword. This is a very close port of the game. Outside of a change in some sprites, the game now stars a Beatle-style protagonist. It looks and plays almost identically to the original. The game's fun and accessible and has some very nice art design and colour use throughout. The developers, Westone, also released another action-adventure game on the PC Engine named Blood Gear, which was ineligible for the list, but should be checked out by fans of this game who don't mind the language barrier. This has to be the second most famous and popular block-falling puzzle game, after the almighty Tetris itself. After that quintessential puzzle classic became huge, other companies tried to come up with their own winning formula, and out of those, Compile's Puyo Puyo was the one to really hit the mark and do something new with the idea. Puyo Puyo has you matching up 4 blobs of a colour to remove them from the playfield, but by setting them up in a certain way, you can create a domino effect, comboing away multiple sets of blobs at once. Unlike many of the competition, the combo system in Puyo Puyo is very intuitive and easy to pick up, making for an excellent 2-player competitive experience. As a port, this is pretty good. The voice acting especially is quite notable, but admittedly the visuals are a little weaker than in the other 4th gen ports of the game. Here's a really nice, really fast-paced action game for the system, which has you playing as a ninja one-man army, slashing his sword and shuriken throwing his way through legions of bad guys. Ninja Spirit's best aspects are its rock-solid control system, which gives you a lot of room for flair and mastery, and its cool power-ups, ranging from longer sword range to a gang of clones which follow your every move. You also get to choose from a variety of different weapons, which all change the gameplay up a little too. It's a very dynamic and exciting arcade action game for the time, and this brilliant port contains both the original arcade game recreated faithfully, and actually there's an argument this is superior in some ways, and a PC Engine dedicated mode which has been made a little easier too, with the inclusion of a health bar, a nice addition for people starting out. Simply a phenomenal version of an arcade classic. This sequel to the aforementioned Bonk's Adventure just has to be the most notable Bonk release on the system. With this sequel the levels were much more ambitious, brimming with stuff to find from heart containers to bonus games, and due to the addition of end of level lifts that counted your collected smileys, said bonus games were actually made a lot more critical to the gameplay than before, as gaining enough of them could send you to a different destination and a much appreciated health upgrade. The graphics here have been overhauled and serve to create a much more impressive looking world filled with offbeat, memorable characters and much more polished visuals than were seen in the original, which had been a fairly early release for the system. And on top of all this, they still managed to retain all of the humour and rewarding gameplay that made the original so beloved. In a running for being the greatest pinball video game ever made, Devil's Crush gives you one of the most memorable tables of the genre, and a cult-themed table of skeletons and demons, and builds on its excellent forebear Alien Crush brilliantly, with a taller, free-screen table that scrolls, more numerous scene changes, differing objectives, and even some new, cool boss fights too. Graphics and audio are both excellently done here as well, and the whole thing is just skillfully and expertly crafted, with a ton of polish and care. Even those not interested in pinball should at least give this one a chance. Blazing Lasers was an early Turbo title that was pretty much the kickstarter for the system's enduring reputation as a shoot-'em-up fan's dream console. The game was made by genre stalwarts Compile, and Blazing Lasers shows its pedigree well, with smooth, frenetic action that doesn't let up and a multitude of different and interesting weapons to choose from. Later Turbo shooters may have taken its core concepts and built on them, but Blazing Lasers remains one of the more memorable and atmospheric shooters on the system, due in large part to its excellent music and presentation, and it's remembered as one of the more critical releases during the system's early lifespan. Here's a wacky, humorous scrolling shooter starring the character Zonk, who was created to be a futuristic, updated counterpart to the PC Engine's mascot character, Bonk. Bonk was originally called PC Genjin in Japan, which is a play on words meaning essentially caveman, with this character, Zonk's name, PC Denjin, instead meaning something like Electric Man. The game must be one of the most impressive U-card releases on the system. The screen is rarely not packed with frenzied action, with enemy sprites flying around and huge death-dealing attacks coming from Zonk at a rapid pace. There's also loads of smooth parallax in the backgrounds, and everything is just colourful and drawn with lots of charm too. Gameplay wise, generally this is just explosive balls to the wall action, but some other minor features do add some minor tactics to the game. You get to choose a support character for each level for instance, each of which give you different combinations of attacks. And you also get a sort of afterburner attack if you skim quite close to the enemies. All in all, a very impressive release for the system that manages to really stand out from the crowd. The classic world-building sim / real-time strategy hybrid was ported to the PC Engine here very well with everything intact. You play God to your people, helping them grow and prosper by terraforming the land and giving them simple instructions to follow, with the ultimate goal being to facilitate their dominance over their enemies. You also get to use magic to sabotage the other peoples of the land. It was a seminal release for the genre and a highly influential game. Populous was released on both HuCard and CD, with the CD version including the original game plus the expansion, The Promised Land, as well as a bunch of exclusive stages which are actually quite a nice addition, with themes around Bomberman and the PC Engine in general. The game does not support the mouse, but honestly due to the game's grid-based movement it works well with a joypad anyway. A very nice version of the game. This frenetic sequel to the Turbo Shmup classic Gate of Thunder was a huge departure for the series, but manages to be another exceptional release nonetheless. The gameplay here has you flying through fantasy worlds controlling a flying god wearing knight's armour. You get to choose from multiple different element-themed armours when you start the game, each with different moves that can be powered up, and the usual shot-based weaponry is complemented with a risky close-quarters melee strike with your sword, which adds another level of dynamism to the gameplay. The presentation here is up to the high quality of its predecessor, with some really sumptuous graphics and a lot of attention to detail, and the varied stages and set pieces are as imaginative and memorable as ever. And here again Hudson Soft managed to deliver a fantastic and wildly impressive SNK port that proved to be leagues better than the other 4th generation home console versions, apart from the Neo Geo itself of course. After a good start with some fun releases, Fatal Fury Special, itself essentially an improved special edition of Fatal Fury 2, It's where the series really came into its own and became a true player, vying to topple the almighty Street Fighter. The game includes all the usual fighting game tropes, but crucially here, you also get 2 separate layers that you can jump back and forth between to avoid attacks. And the gameplay also tends to have more focus on setting up and reacting to your opponent's actions. As said, it's an incredible port overall, looking fantastic and playing really well. It serves as another real flagship title for the system that really showed what it could achieve in the right hands. This is a nice, accessible turn-based strategy game in the vein of games like Advance Wars. Here the aim is to try to move your units around the map into the best strategic positions, with terrain and surrounding supporting units playing a big part in how much damage is done, and crucial factories and bases littered around the map being able to be captured and used to heal your units. As the battles go on, your forces gain experience with every successful attack, which is another nice element to the game. All in all, a great strategy game for its time, and it was assuredly one of the standout HuCard releases back in the day too, going on to influence other games such as the Amiga's popular Battle Isle. All the different elements here just really come together well to add real depth, and it's fun and doesn't take itself too seriously either. Most definitely one of the most important scrolling shooters of the 80s. R-Type introduced some of the most intricate level designs and clever power-up systems the gaming world had ever seen, all infused with some excellent Alien H.R. Geiger inspired art design. So impressive and unprecedented was the Turbo's port of R-Type that it was probably the closest the system came to having a killer application in those early days here in the UK. It's not quite a perfect port of the game, but it makes a pretty damn good stab at it. The game was originally released in 2 halves in Japan, Part 1 and Part 2, but the US Turbo chip and CD release provided the full game. And in this CD version here you also got some nice new cutscenes taking place between some of the stages too. All in all, this was a very notable port of one of the legendary classics of the scrolling shooter genre. Another release in the Soldier series, and with this Hudson managed to hone their shmup making skills even further, with this being both the final and best game in the series release for the console, and in fact one of the console's greatest shmups in general. Here we have the tried and true formula of the series: frenetic action, exciting boss fights and brilliant weapons, except now with even better graphics and more awesome set pieces than ever, and some of the most impressive music to come out of the PC Engine sound chip. I'd say this has to be the #1 HuCard shoot 'em up on the system, and for a console that is famous for its shmups, that's no mean feat. Definitely one of my favourite Bomberman releases. Bomberman 94, known more commonly for its Mega Drive port Mega Bomberman, had numerous improvements to the single player gameplay that made it more focused, increasing the pacing and keeping the action moving by removing the requirement to destroy every enemy on screen to proceed, instead of having you go after shield generators. The now scrolling stages are also much more interesting and really do a great job bringing Bomberman's world to life for the first time. The bosses here are also very memorable and imaginative, and they look great. The ever important multiplayer is as fun as ever, with this one introducing Ruiz to the series, rideable creatures that give you an extra hit point and an ability, and there's also some nice variety in the different multiplayer battlegrounds. Note that this is actually quite a bit better than the later Mega Drive release too, with more detailed, better coloured graphics, superior animation, less slowdown, and 5-player support as opposed to Mega Bomberman's 4-player limitation. A real high point for the series. Compile, the most consistent 4th generation shmup company, do it again with another excellent release here. The game has all the hallmarks of the company's classic releases, games like Space Megaforce on the SNES or the Mega Drive's classic Musha, with there being lots of action and screen-filling weapons from start to finish here. The power-up system has you collecting coloured orbs. You can hold 3 at a time, and different combinations of colours have different effects, so it's wise to experiment with them, which is actually one of the game's more interesting elements. Overall, Spriggan is one of the most impressive games on the system. It looks good, sounds great, and has some memorable set pieces and level designs too. This includes remakes of the first 2 games in the popular East series, with new FMVs and fantastic new CD audio, unarguably some of the best quality music of its era. These have been combined into a single, merged game. So these 2 titles played like a mixture of Zelda and action RPGs. You get a lot of puzzle-filled dungeons, and fights are kind of active. It has an odd system where you run into enemies at an angle to damage them. But of course, given it's an RPG, there's also a lot of focus on gaining experience and buying equipment. The first game is simplistic but fairly short. Much of the original game's time was taken up with grinding, which has largely been removed here with the game being streamlined and made pacier. This change turns the first game into a sort of intro to the more complex sequel. A good decision, and they're actually quite seamlessly joined as well. One of the Turbo CD's most important and impressive early releases, and in fact, given that this was one of the first ever games to attempt to properly utilise the CD format seen in the West, one of the most important releases of the whole 80s in general, and a bit of a footnote in history to be honest. So Sapphire is a phenomenal release from the same company as the SNES classic Hagane, developers who were actually formed out of Red Company's superb Thunder development team, who had already created two of the Turbo's best shmups before going their own way, Gate of Thunder and Winds of Thunder. It's an incredibly impressive vertically scrolling shmup that has you blasting and weaving your way through the stages, shooting at legions of enemies and coming up against some of the most memorable bosses with some of the most complex attack sequences of its generation. The game gives you the usual selection of smart bombs and weapons power-ups, but also allows you to send off your helpers to attack the larger enemies too, done by letting go of the fire button. The graphics here are just astounding, especially the game's animation, which fully utilises the system's CD media to create some of the smoothest and most complicated visuals of the entire generation, with excellent pseudo 3D and scaling effects and huge rotating bosses. Definitely one of the most graphically impressive games of its time. Street Fighter II was everywhere in the early to mid-90s, being ported to almost everything. The game was absolutely huge and was assuredly one of the most influential games in the entire history of the media. Thankfully the PC Engine was not left out, and in 1993 it got its own very respectable version of the seminal title. And I should think so too, given that the PC Engine was actually the only console at the time to get a port of the original Street Fighter, which was actually a launch title for its CD unit no less. This sequel on the other hand was released on HuCard, but few compromises were made, and overall this compares very favourably to the other console versions, even containing slightly better colour use than the Mega Drive version. All in all a great version of a classic game, and it's a real shame that American Turbografx users never got to experience it. Games like Gate of Thunder are the reason for the Turbo's fame as a shmup lover's dream console. For anyone who's played them, Gate of Thunder resembles the Mega Drive's brilliant Thunder Force series of games, and for good reason as well, as it's believed that this was actually made by ex-Technosoft staff, working under pseudonyms. You get multiple types of weapons, each of which are useful for different situations, and you can swap them out on the fly depending on what's needed at a particular time. Each weapon here can also be upgraded by collecting power-ups, and the direction of fire can also be turned by pressing both buttons. All of this does a great job of giving the action an extra level of complexity and strategy. Outside of the gameplay, we have some very impressive graphics and some really memorable audio too, not to mention what has to be one of my favourite intros in the whole of retro gaming history. Simply a classic shoot 'em up through and through. And in the number one spot of course we have Rondo of Blood, easily the best Castlevania of its era, bar none. The game continued the classic whip-cracking gameplay of the originals, with you jumping and manoeuvring through the moody, monster-infested stages, whilst also including some of the more interesting elements from Castlevania 3, namely its branching paths and multiple characters and endings, with the second character Maria here providing the more accessible, wackier playthrough to complement Richter's more serious adventure. The presentation is especially notable here, with the capabilities of the emerging CD format put to very good use. On top of looking and sounding great with some absolutely phenomenal CD quality music that includes some of the best compositions in the series, the animation is great, especially for the bosses. There's impressive animated cutscenes, and overall the whole thing just includes lots and lots of content and replay value to keep you coming back again and again. Konami were nice enough to bless the PC Engine with what was the definitive Castlevania of its era, and the game would go on to gain a direct sequel continuing on its plot and characters, with the release of Symphony of the Night, which for most people would become the most beloved release in the entire series. Well, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it then please like and subscribe, and maybe consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description. See ya! So as promised, here's a quick list of what the Japanese fans consider the best RPGs on the system, plus a few adventure/sim games added in for good measure too. I'd imagine at least 20 of these games likely could have made the list if they had been commercially released in English,